In the next half hour or so, I'm going to share with you some amazing stuff about the wars of Gog and Magog. Christians call it Armageddon, it's the same thing, but please be patient. I think it's going to be worth your time. I'm often asked, considering today's geopolitical structure, how will the wars of Gog and Magog play out? Who will be involved? How will they begin? How will they end? It's a great question. Smart people over the centuries tried to figure it out. They tried to identify the players in this apocalyptic battle. It was simply impossible to do it then. You'll soon understand why. The war of Gog and Magog actually started 30 years ago, and we're now approaching high noon. Let me explain. The war is described in detail in Yechezkel, chapters 38 and 39, and Zechariah chapters 12 through 14. The two accounts complement one another. Certain details are left out of one account, but they're filled in with the second one. You can read these chapters on your own to get the whole picture, but in a nutshell, there'll be a nation to which the prophet assigns the name Magog. Led by a king, the prophet calls Gog. Our tradition tells us that this nation will be the undisputed superpower at that time and will lead an alliance with many other nations. The names of the allied nations detailed in Yechezkel cannot be identified with modern nations, with the exception of one of them, Iran. It's clearly identified by its original name, Persia. That's the name in the Bible. That was the name for thousands of years until it was changed to Iran in 1935. These nations will wage war against Israel with particular focus on Jerusalem. God Almighty will defend Israel against these nations and crush their armies to smithereens. It will be clear to the whole world that this was a miraculous event, an act of God, and his name will be sanctified among all the nations. Yiskadal v'yiskada Shemei Rabba. After that, the Jews will rest securely in their land. The Holy Temple will be rebuilt on the Temple Mount, and Mashiach, the Messiah, will rule the world from Jerusalem. In 1991, the Lubavitcher Rebbe announced that it was revealed to him that everything that had to be accomplished before the Messiah could come had already been accomplished. Furthermore, he declared that the very last deadline for the beginning of the process of redemption had already arrived. Part of the process of redemption involves the wars of Gog and Magog. So at that point, the wars of Armageddon were set in motion. The war is essentially a manifestation of the metaphysical guardian angels of all the nations, but primarily those associated with Esav, that is, Western civilization led by the United States, and Islamic civilization associated with Yishmael, today led by Iran. These forces mount their last attempt to block the process of redemption, which would eventually spell the complete demise of their empires and their power. Being that Mashiach rules from Jerusalem, and the godly light of prophecy and redemption emanates from the Holy Temple, specifically from the original tablets housed in the Ark in the Holy of Holies, these forces will use every trick in the book to ensure that Jerusalem, and specifically the Temple Mount, does not remain in Jewish hands. Now, something else also occurred at the same time. The walls of the Iron Curtain, which shackled the subjects of the Soviet Union, including the Jews, for 70 years, and barred most of them from leaving their exile and ascending to the Holy Land, these walls came crumbling down in that very year. Hundreds of thousands of Jews left the USSR to make their new home in the land of Israel. As mentioned earlier, according to our tradition, the kingdom of Magog is the undisputable superpower which will dominate the world at the time of redemption. This is obviously the United States. The king is identified as Gog. The name does not refer to a specific person, but rather to the group of presidents who are involved in the war against Jerusalem. It's similar to when the Bible uses the term Pharaoh, which is not referring to a specific person, but rather to whoever happens to be sitting on the throne in Egypt at a specific time. Thus, the king who Joseph encounters is Pharaoh, and the king of the Exodus, who was challenged and humiliated by Moses over 200 years later, is also called Pharaoh. But why the name Gog? 2 of the 6 presidents who are involved in the wars against Jerusalem are named George. They are also the primary instigators of this war, as I will explain shortly. In Hebrew, the three primary letters that spell the name George are Gimel, Vav, Gimel, Gog. And that is why the presidency during this period is referred to by the name Gog. In addition, it might be a nom de guerre for American presidents in general, because the first American president was George. Just like all the Jews are called Yisrael, after our father Jacob, who was named Yisrael, Israel, and Jews are also called Yehudim, because of Yehuda, the son of Jacob. George is of Greek origin, and from the root geo, which means related to the earth, just like the word geography. George means a man of the field, a farmer, and that's exactly how the Torah describes Esav. Vayigdalu hanaorim, vahi Esav ish yedei atzayid ish sada. Esav was a man of the field. That's a verse in Genesis chapter 25, verse 27. Esav is preoccupied with the physical. Ish sada v'Yaakov ish tam yeshev v'holim. Jacob is a spiritual man and a scholar. The 6 presidents are as follows. The first one, the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. The second one, Bill Clinton. The third, the 43rd President, George W. Bush. The fourth, Barack Hussein Obama. The fifth, the 45th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And the sixth is our very own Joe Biden. We read in Psalms chapter 2, and we have a tradition that this chapter in Psalms is referring to the wars of Armageddon. The verse says, "Lama rog shugoyim ul'umim yegurik yisyatzu malchei aretz v'reiznim yoystu yochad al Hashem v'al Mashiach." Why do nations convene and people utter absurdities? Kings of the earth take their stand, and their ministers conspire together against God and against His anointed. Let us tear off the cords of their yoke and throw off their ropes from us. He who sits in heaven laughs, God scoffs at them. Then he speaks to them in anger and terrifies them with his wrath. It is I who appointed my king over Zion, my holy mountain. It seems like King David is alluding to the fact that during the wars of the alliance of nations led by Gog, king of Magog, world leaders are convening and conspiring to come up with sophisticated plans to attack Jerusalem. It isn't feasible to openly declare war and engage in a frontal military assault, which involves a direct full-force attack on the front lines of Jerusalem. As I mentioned earlier, the Land of Magog is the United States of America. We know this for a fact because we have a tradition that Magog is a superpower of the world. It is also alluded to in the numeric value of the word Magog, which is 52, representing the 52 political entities comprising the United States of America. The 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico, which have all the characteristics of a state and have the potential to be recognized as such at any time. Had the wars of Armageddon taken place when the Roman Empire ruled the civilized world, they would have no issues conquering Jerusalem just because they had the power to do so. They wouldn't need any excuses. And indeed, this is exactly what they did in the year 70 when they conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the Holy Temple. However, being that the current manifestation of the satanic forces of Esav is ostensibly a Western democracy founded upon freedom and justice, an attack on Jerusalem needs to be cloaked in a fictitious justification that can be presented to the world as being consistent with Western values. Thus, as soon as the Rebbe shared his divine revelation that Messianic times were about to begin, Esav needed to make use of his pig feet. In the book of Psalms, chapter 80, we have a verse, Yichasmena chazir miyar, a wild boar or pig will devour them. And this, according to our sages, is referring to Esav. And he's compared to a pig because a pig who's thoroughly not kosher, and in fact is the icon of non-kosher food, attempts to conceal his unclean status by showing off his cloven hoofs, which is one of the signs of a kosher animal. In a similar way, the thoroughly unclean forces of Satan / Edom / Rome / Western civilization present themselves as being pure and righteous. Thus, the first incarnation of Gog, the 41st president, George H.W. Bush, understood his satanic mission very well. He was elected to ensure that Jerusalem does not remain in Jewish hands, but he also understood that he cannot publicly declare his true goals. After the Holocaust and the establishment of the state in Israel, was officially endorsed by the United States and even the Soviet Union, the United Nations. Bush couldn't simply say that we're taking the capital, the holy city of Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount away from the Jews and giving it over to theirs, as well as Americans' sworn, bloodthirsty, sadistic Islamic enemies, simply because we are stronger than the Jews and we could get away with it. So George, together with his sidekick, Secretary of State James F. the Jews Baker, conceived of the Madrid Conference. The plan was to convince the world that there is a fictitious people called Palestinians, whose rights to the land of Israel and Jerusalem override the rights of the Jews. And therefore, in the name of justice and compassion on these peaceful and oppressed people, we must force the Jews to acknowledge that peace will never be achieved, and the Jews will continue to suffer death and destruction until they acknowledge that the Temple Mount is primarily an Islamic holy site, and the Jews have no right to step foot on it. So declared King George of the Land of Magog. The same completely nefarious justification for wresting the Temple Mount away from Jews would continue to be echoed by the next 5 presidents, culminating with our current president, Joe Bumbling Biden. As mentioned earlier, at the very time that the Rebbe declared that our exile is essentially over, the gates of the Iron Curtain were opened and Jews were free to go to Israel. Indeed, 330,000 Jews chose to do so. However, the cost to absorb these Jews, who would arrive virtually penniless, was staggering for a tiny country like Israel. They needed to borrow $10 billion. They had ways of raising the funds, providing that the American government would sign a guarantee that the funds would be repaid. This was essentially no risk for America because Israel had never ever defaulted on a loan. Now the cunning George H.W. Bush had an idea. He would force the Israeli government, led at the time by Yitzhak Shamir, to agree to begin the process of transferring Gaza, Yehuda, and Shomron, including Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, to the Arab Islamic Nazis led by a monster named Arafat, who were at the time in the midst of a bloodfest they called an intifada, to brutally murder as many men, women, and Jewish children as they can get their hands on. Of course, there are plenty of decent Arabs and Muslims, but Gog, George, chose to align himself with the inhuman and sadistic ones. The snake, George Bush, refused to sign the guarantees unless Shamir would agree to his diabolical plans for Jerusalem. Unfortunately, Shamir, who was the most right-wing prime minister Israel ever had, buckled under pressure. The Rebbe, whose role is to fight against the force of Gog Magog, as we mentioned in video number 30, being Mashiach ben Yosef, he warned Shamir that if he proceeds to involve himself in the Madrid talks, he, the Rebbe, would personally fight with all his might to remove him from power. But Shamir buckled to his American masters. From Madrid, the conspiracy progressed to Oslo. The next member of the Gog cabal, Bill Clinton, forced the Oslo Accords on Yitzhak Rabin, who shamefully shook the bloody hands of Arafat Yimach Shemoy, so that he, together with his rival Shimon Peres, could share the Nobel Peace Prize with that murderous monster. The Chillul Hashem, the desecration of God's holy name, was beyond disgraceful, handing over parts of our sacred homeland, gifted to us by God, and paid for with Jewish blood, to the enemies of God and his chosen people. The accord stipulated that after a few years, the process of handing over the Temple Mount would begin. Arafat decided not to wait, and continued to unleash his bloodthirsty Islamic murderers and encourage them to give up their lives in the holy act of murdering Jewish men, women, and children to satisfy the lust of their pagan caricature of God and to satisfy their own lust for 72 virgins. The next George Bush, son of George Bush I, and a chip off the old block, took the wars of Gog Magog to the next level. Under his watch, on 9/11, 2001, the ugly and dark face of fundamentalist Islamic cruelty and bloodlust struck America with ferocious force, resulting in the horrific loss of 3,000 innocent American lives. One would have hoped that finally the American leadership would begin to understand what the Jews in Israel are up against and cease and desist bullying Israel into making suicidal concessions to these subhuman monsters. But George Gog Bush II did exact opposite. It is actually mind-boggling. Right after 9/11, he embraced Islam and moved his father's brainchild, the Madrid-Oslo conspiracy, to the next level. His father and Clinton realized that they cannot talk about two states, only autonomy. Jews would never agree to actually give up sovereignty of their promised land to their sworn enemies, granting them actual statehood with an official army with tanks and fighter planes to attack Israel, and airports where they can officially bring in the latest ammunition and missiles from Iran, China, Russia, and any other country who could not care less about another Holocaust. The Rebbe called their bluff and repeatedly stressed that autonomy was meant as a euphemism for statehood. But the Israeli prime ministers, from Begin all the way through Netanyahu, from the right to the left and in between, went along with their American overlords and submitted to them like timid sheep. They prostrated themselves to the closest and most reliable ally, the USA, who continued to stab them in the back at every opportunity, from the time they slammed the door shut on tens of thousands of Jews who attempted to escape Hitler's inferno. Now Bush felt he can push his Israeli subjects further. Why not? They have proven themselves over and over to be such submissive wimps. Let's just cut to the chase and say what we mean. Two states. From then on, that became the official U.S. position. No peace and security for the Jews until Israel commits suicide. Of course, Gog the 43rd was right. The cockroaches occupying Balfour Street in Jerusalem, and referred to as Prime Minister of Israel, were in truth nothing more than American puppets. This includes the great Bibi, who officially embraced the U.S. suicide plan in 2009, and until this very day is too timid and terrified of his U.S. masters to openly and categorically say the truth. Everybody knows the truth. The idea of inviting bloodthirsty, sadistic Arab-speaking Nazis who celebrate and incentivize the murder of Jewish men, women, and children to destroy us by granting them a sovereign state in our backyard is beyond insane. But Bibi the Great revealed to the whole world in that infamous speech delivered in Bar Ilan University, an institute of higher intelligence, that politics is the exact opposite of intelligence. It's all about stupidities. He endorsed the suicidal two-state conspiracy with a caveat that the state of Palestine will not have an army. He reiterated the same nonsense at Bar Ilan in 2013. Gaza is not a state, yet the IDF and the Shin Bet, one of the greatest armies and intelligence agencies in the world, are powerless to stop them from building a formidable army and a huge stockpile of missiles capable of terrorizing the whole country. The Arabs in Yehuda and Shomron don't have a state, but hundreds of thousands are heavily armed. They regularly steal ammunition from Israeli army bases right under the nose of the mighty IDF. Jewish blood is spilled like water almost weekly, Rachmana litzlan ha'ylesia. The most right-wing government Israel ever had is powerless to completely disarm these sadistic murderers. Yet Netanyahu seriously believes that once they have a sovereign state of their own, someone is going to stop them from building an army. Who is he trying to fool? The truth is that Bibi is the best prime minister Israel ever had, but he too is being controlled by the forces of Gog Magog. Now let's get back to America. After Bush, with the memory of 9/11 still fresh in the minds of Americans, the incredibly brain-dead, leaning citizens of this great country decided to elect an Islamic American for president, a slimeball named Hussein. Hussein Obama spent 8 years in office stabbing Israel in the back. 1 month before his departure in December 2016, he delivered his parting punch. He got the UN to pass a resolution essentially stating that Jerusalem and the Temple Mount are illegally occupied by Israel and they must be immediately gifted to his Islamic buddies. But he had a problem. The original Madrid-Oslo two-state conspiracy was not moving along, not because the weak and timid Israelis were standing in the way. It was the Arabs occupying Gaza, Yehuda, and Shomron that had proven over and over that they had zero interest in officially acknowledging that Jews have even a minuscule right to even a tiny truncated land in the Middle East, even if all their outrageous demands were met. Obama was forced to move on to Plan B. If we can't get the timid Jews to give away Jerusalem because the Arabic-speaking extremist Muslims are standing in the way, then we need to get the Persian-speaking crazy maniacal mullahs of Iran involved. In the 1950s, America helped Iran develop an ostensibly non-military nuclear program. Why not continue to help them actually build a nuclear bomb? This way, they can threaten Israel that if they don't hand over the holy city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount to the faithful and the superior religion of Islam, they will incinerate Israel and all its inhabitants with their nukes. This was Obama's diabolical plan, masked as an agreement to contain Iran's nuclear program. Of course, he and everybody else knew his real intentions, but that's politics. The Biden administration is picking up where Obama left off, desperately begging Iran to continue on their march toward the bomb. Iran is playing hardball. They keep asking the American Christians to bow down lower and lower to the guardians of Islam if they want them to do the dirty work that Magog is supposed to do, and that is wrest Jerusalem away from the Jews. And Biden keeps on submitting to his Iranian partners in this war against Jerusalem. He has no choice. It's his destiny. He recently gifted them almost $3 billion to finance the nuclear program and their proxy war against Israel. He couldn't give them the funds outright without Congress, so he allowed Iraq to repay its $2.75 billion debt to Iran on purchases of natural gas using funds previously frozen by U.S. sanctions. Biden has given hundreds of millions to the bloodthirsty terrorist Mahmoud Abbas so he can continue paying his goons to kill Jews and supporting the families of those who are caught or killed. Biden is deeply troubled when Jews build homes for their growing families in Yehuda and Shomron, and he cut off all American funding for joint research projects with universities in Israel's heartland. Biden is so deeply disappointed when Jews burn tires on Arab cars, most of which actually were stolen from the Jews. But he doesn't lose any sleep when Arabs murder almost on a weekly basis Jewish men, women, and children in cold blood. Don't let this old, bumbling, cognitively challenged six-member of the Gogite clan fool you. He is Obama on steroids. You're probably wondering why I included Donald Trump as one of the six faces of Gog. I voted for him too, and I would vote for him again without hesitation. Trump was indeed the most pro-Israel president in American history. He's 1,000 times better than the other five fellow Gogites. Indeed. Trump keeps reminding us how much he did for the Jews and for Israel, and how he doesn't understand why the majority of Jews are so ungrateful. Most of them did not vote for him in 2016, 2021, and do not plan to vote for him in 2024. So let me explain it to you, dear President. The Jews who do not support you are completely submerged in radical left-wing ideologies. They are Jewish in body, but unfortunately their minds have been washed and bleached in American universities. Those who do possess Jewish minds, which includes the overwhelming majority of the Orthodox Jewish community plus many others, are very appreciative of you and indeed support you and will continue to support you with their votes and their money. Yet, although Trump was 1,000 times better than the other five, he too was part of the war against Jerusalem. Moving the embassy to West Jerusalem was not a big deal. Israel gained absolutely nothing from it. Not one Jewish life was saved by this move. Neither was recognizing the Golan. There was no serious attempt to take the Golan or West Jerusalem from the Jews. All the kippah-wearing Jews involved in making the move of the embassy and involved in the Abraham Accords a reality have declared in numerous interviews and books how amazing they are, and they continue to repeat to whoever is interested in hearing them boast how they changed the reality in the Middle East. And I'm referring to Jared Kushner together with his sidekick Avi Berkowitz, Jason Greenblatt, David Friedman. The sad truth is that these accomplishments did nothing to enhance the security of the Jews in Israel, not one iota. Moreover, they were actually counterproductive. The fact that Trump only recognized the west part of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and the fact that he endorsed the deal of the century, which is a euphemism for giving away chunks of our biblical land to create another Gaza on the east side of Israel, underscores the fact that he, although very different from the other five, is essentially on the same team and controlled by the same spiritual forces of Gog Magog with regards to the future of the Temple Mount and the real Jerusalem. Western Jerusalem has nothing to do with the holy city of Jerusalem. Just because the modern secular state of Israel declares an area to be part of Jerusalem does not, from a Torah perspective, have any validity. Had he opened the embassy in the old city, he would have effectively reversed the efforts of the other five openly hostile U.S. presidents, but he did not. When Pompeo, who I believe is a good guy who likes Jews and supports Israel, spoke about the biblical heartlands of Yehuda and Shomron, he did not say that all the settlements were legal, as was widely misreported. All he could muster up to say was that the establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not per se inconsistent with international law. Thank you very much. That was very helpful. The Abraham Accords, which all the above kippah-wearing Jews claim are nothing less than historically monumental achievements for Israel and will bring peace on earth, are actually nothing of the sort. It's nice to have trade and security relations with Arab countries, but none of these countries ever posed a threat to Israel. And the Accords do absolutely zero to advance the Jewish right to the holy city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. To the contrary, with regard to the main focus of the armies of Gog Magog, which is Jerusalem, the Accords are counterproductive. All the countries involved in the Accords made it very clear that they will not tolerate a Jewish takeover of the Temple Mount. And after a recent Israeli operation in Jenin, which eliminated 12 terrorists and left over hundreds to continue their murderous operations, our buddies in the UAE pledged millions to rebuild all the damage so that those monsters can get back to Jew-killing occupations as soon as possible. The big shot Bibi Netanyahu, who claims he is about to ink a deal with Saudi Arabia, which in his fantasies will end once and for all the Arab-Israeli conflict, fails to admit the steep price that he would have to pay for such a deal. He would have to acknowledge the rights of the fictitious Islamic bloodthirsty Nazis calling themselves Palestinians to big chunks of our biblical heritage, and specifically to the holy city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Recently, the brilliant Bibi and all his brilliant advisors announced plans to save Mahmoud Abbas, the Nazi, from oblivion. It's not enough that Biden is giving this corrupt, bloodthirsty Jew hater hundreds of millions of American taxpayer money, with Bibi saying absolutely nothing to criticize his old buddy Biden and jeopardize an invitation to the White House, which Biden probably will use to publicly castigate him for not being more aggressive against the extreme right-wing elements in his government who actually brought him to power, thanks to an Israeli truly democratic voting system which is not so easily manipulated like that in the US. On top of all that, now Israel, with 2 million of its citizens below poverty line, is planning to hand over many more millions into the blood-drenched hands of Mahmoud Abbas, so that he can keep up his payments to Jew killers and their families and fund all forms of incitement platforms, school curricular, children's TV shows, etc., to keep on spewing forth vicious Nazi poison into the minds of future terrorists. And Bibi keeps going. He recently boasted about a visa waiver program with the US he is about to sign. Now Israelis will be able to travel to the US without a visa. Whoopie-doo. Of course, we get nothing from our closest ally for free. A small price was demanded by the State Department for this amazing privilege. Potential terrorists with U.S. citizenship have to be allowed into Israel without background checks. Great job, Bibi. Just to recap, the wars of Gog and Magog, referred to by the Christians as Armageddon, began over 30 years ago, and America, the biblical Magog, is getting desperate. The Biden administration is hell-bent on assisting Iran to get the bomb before the old man gets so cuckoo he will not only confuse China with India and Ukraine with Iraq, but he will start saying what he truly believes, that we need to ensure before the next elections that Iran gets the bomb before Trump comes back and holds up my plans. Make no mistake, even if Trump pulls out of Biden's deals with Iran and reimposes severe sanctions, it's not going to stop Iran from going forward. To the contrary, Iran went much further towards their goals under Trump than under Obama. Stay tuned. We have a lot more to share with you. Please subscribe if you have not already done so. Until next time, may God be with you.